You know, Konstantin, that leads into this discussion that you guys have been having, which you talked about the reaction to the event, the outrage, and whether or not it can veer too far in another direction. And it does veer, as you point out, in a predictable direction. And it's inherently unappealing, at least to me, because I don't like feeling that way all the time. I don't like feeling negative. And I've just noticed this recurring theme for you and for both of you guys, but this is to you, Konstantin, this recurring theme of we have to find leaders. And I don't even know if we can go about finding leaders if we can't first find it in ourselves, of how do we build a constructive, positive vision of the future?
Isn't that so interesting that you said we have to find it inside ourselves? And I think that's universally true across the Western world, where when people do come through who are willing to be blunt and honest, which is what we need people to be direct and honest about the tremendous problems we face in our societies. They are immediately misrepresented, attacked, destroyed. And what that means is we then end up with only massive narcissists going into politics, because those are the only people who can stand the experience. I have quite a lot of friends that I know who are kind of in our game in the media world, and people say to them, you know, would you go into politics? And they say, why? I'm going to get paid less in order to be shouted at by half the country because I'm going to try and say something that I believe. And so unless we stop doing that, the leaders we have now are the best it's ever going to get.
But so, Francis, what I mean is, so I think by our very nature, easily we access outrage, easily we access negativity. It's just so easy. And by the way, for guys that do what we do, that becomes a really cheap currency to gaining an audience. But I think it's also somewhat hollow in that it wears off. I mean, not only do I create content, I consume a lot of content. You know, and so when I'm sitting there thinking, like, what do I want to watch? What do I want to listen to? I don't want to feel negative. And not just, that's just on the entertainment front, but also like on the what is my purpose in this world front. There's just the reaction to wokeism, okay, which is an ideology of destruction. It's inherently what it's about. It's destroying the past. Now, I'll give them, in an attempt to try to understand, that maybe they have a utopic aspiration of the future. But the answer to that has to be that there is an alternative positive vision that's not hollow, and that over time, people go to, because, look, I actually think people, we easily destroy. That's an easy thing to do. It's hard to create, but we're also attracted to creation.
Yeah, and one thing as well that I think that we don't talk about when we talk about destruction is the high people get from destruction. Not only is it easy, but it's also, you feel justified in your destruction. You get a visceral thrill from destroying something. How easy is it to tear down a statue, throw it in a river, and all of a sudden you feel like a revolutionary? It's actually far more difficult than going to art college, learning how to become a sculptor, then dedicating your life to becoming a sculptor, and then at one point in your career being able to create a life-size and lifelike statue. That can take a lifetime of learning, whilst tearing a statue down, throwing it in a river, feeling like a hero, can take a matter of hours. So the reality is, I think more and more, is that we've been encouraged to think in the short term, whether it's as content providers, creating content which can create outrage and then go viral, but actually when you look at the substance, there's not much there, or on the other side of it, tearing that statue down and throwing it in the river.
You know, I sometimes I'm real self-conscious about, I mean, I love this kind of conversation. I don't want to veer away from it. I'm also like, well, does the audience think this is too in the clouds, 30,000 feet? It's too esoteric. It's too abstract all the times. But, like, I watched a speech from you, Konstantin, where you're talking about it specifically applicable to what's happening. Like, you said the housing crisis. You talk about the housing crisis among young people, right? And you said you can't expect young people to not want to turn over the game board and be a revolutionary if they can't access the basic fundamentals of building a life, which you talk about is like buying a house, building a family inside of a house. Like, it's not just 30,000 feet we're talking about here. It's like, you better give young people a positive answer or they're just going to gravitate to destruction because what exists doesn't offer them a solution.
Right. And think about, the great promise, I think, of our societies is that our children will do better than us. That is just not factually correct for the next generation that's coming. It's not going to be the case. And the reason is, if you think about what the American dream was in the 1960s, it was a house with a white picket fence, 2 or 3 kids, or with one person in the family having to work. Typically, the man goes into a fairly low-level job, working in a factory, driving a truck, whatever it is, and he can provide for his family. I was having a conversation with one of our guys here at the studio today, who's basically planning to do that. He wants to get married, have children, have a place of his own, blah, 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 blah. And when we sat down and I was trying to help him map out his thoughts, we kind of realized that he's probably going to need to be a millionaire in order to be able to have that happen in a way that's comfortable living in London, where a 2-bedroom house is going to cost you £1 million in most of the capital. So if that's the reality you're facing, most people aren't going to be millionaires. That means they're not going to have the things that make people want to stay where they are. Like, once you've got a house and you've got a family and you've got kids and blah, 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 you kind of want to keep things moderately good because you're worried about things going south. But if you've got nothing to lose, there's a whole range of things that are going to look very, very attractive to you that we would rather it didn't. You know what I mean?
And also as well,
Yeah,
I mean, it's a great point by Konstantin. Also as well, you factor in that these young people have seen governments elected into power and successively not deliver on their promises. This Conservative government that we have has had 14 years in power and has done little to nothing to solve the housing crisis, even though they said they would, even though there were various promises made. And as a result of that, these young people are looking at democracy and going, why should I vote? Why should I participate in a democratic system, which, when you look at it, doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work for me. So why should we have democracy? And once you get to that point, then we start entering a very worrying place.
So let's go there for just a moment. That's the topic you recently had on Triggernometry. It's like, which way do young people go? What happens with Gen Z? Francis, I think you were talking about, like, it seems like what's guaranteed is some form of revolution. The question is it that revolution of destruction that we're talking about, further leaning into wokeism, into identity politics, and disavowing ourselves of the past? Or is it one where there can be a positive vision where they can be builders of something in the future? It's like one of two things is going to happen with Gen Z. And you're talking about, like, the split is there, but I think it's on a male-female, demographic line of which way those two groups are leaning.
Yeah, I mean, the worrying thing is that you go, well, if the sexes are so split, and they can't agree on something as fundamental as about how to run a society, how to move forward, we've already got declining birth rates. If we're going to look at Gen Z and they're not going to be able to buy property, and they can't even agree with somebody of the opposite sex, and they're diametrically opposed to them in every way, how are they going to have a relationship? Number one, they're not going to buy property. They're not going to have babies. The birth rate's going to plummet even further. What's going to actually happen to our society? We can't keep importing people and having mass migration, because what you're going to then see is obliteration of a culture. It's incredibly worrying.
And the way to sum it up, Will, I think, is also to look at when we talk about that gender split, yes, the woke path is destructive, but what is on the other side of that? And on the other side of that, I think the best way to sum it up easily, like the male role model for guys my age, that's an elderly millennial, is Jordan Peterson in this kind of space. The role model for Gen Z is Andrew Tate. Now, that's a whole shift in energy and what you're bringing to the table, and whether you are constructive or destructive and all that. So, I think if you just look at that one little data point alone, it kind of tells you where the energy is moving, and we should be really concerned about that, which is why Francis and I have been advocating for a long time now, like, guys, we need to stop this and start thinking about how to bring people together. That isn't what's happening right now, I'm afraid.
Because what you don't want in society is large groups of disenfranchised young men.
Yeah.
When you have large groups of disenfranchised young men, that's when things can get very nasty very quickly.